November 19th, 1944. The Vosges Mountains of eastern France lay shrouded in early winter darkness, the temperature hovering just above freezing as a thin mist clung to the pine forests that stretched endlessly across the rugged terrain. In a forward observation post overlooking a strategic crossroads where two narrow mountain roads intersected, Private First Class James Thornton of the 92nd Infantry Division settled into position with his Springfield rifle, listening to the distant rumble of supply convoys moving through enemy-held territory approximately 300 meters below his rocky perch. The white officers who had dismissed him from sniper training 6 weeks earlier had written in his official military file that he lacked the intelligence and temperament for precision shooting, using language that reflected the deeply ingrained prejudices of the segregated military establishment. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What those officers could not have known, sitting in their warm headquarters making judgments based on skin color rather than demonstrated ability, was that within the next 10 hours, this supposedly inadequate soldier would accomplish something extraordinary that would force the entire command structure to confront their fundamental assumptions about who could be an effective warrior and what true capability looked like when freed from the constraints of prejudice. James Thornton had enlisted in January of 1943 in Detroit, Michigan, leaving behind a well-paying job at the massive Ford Willow Run plant, where he had been assembling B-24 Liberator bombers as part of the wartime production effort that was transforming American industry. He was 23 years old, stood 5 feet 9 inches tall, and weighed approximately 165 pounds, with the lean, muscular build of someone who had spent his youth engaged in physical outdoor activities. He had grown up hunting deer and rabbit in the dense forests of northern Michigan with his grandfather, a man who had been born in the aftermath of the Civil War, and who carried with him a deep understanding of self-reliance and dignity in the face of a society that often denied both to black Americans. His grandfather, Thomas Thornton, had taught him to track game through the woods by reading broken twigs and disturbed leaves, to read the wind by observing how it moved through different layers of tree branches, to control his breathing so that the rise and fall of his chest would not disturb his aim, and most importantly, to be patient and wait for the right moment rather than rushing and wasting an opportunity. These were skills honed over years in the deep woods of Michigan, where a single shot had to count because ammunition was expensive for a family of modest means, and because noise would scatter game for miles around, ruining any chance of success for the rest of the day. When James arrived at basic training at Fort McClellan, Alabama, in the early months of 1943, he quickly demonstrated exceptional marksmanship that set him apart from his fellow recruits. The training facility, located in the hills of northeastern Alabama, was one of several installations where black soldiers received their initial military instruction in segregated conditions that mirrored the civilian society from which they came. On the rifle range, under the critical eyes of experienced instructors who had seen thousands of recruits pass through, James consistently scored expert ratings that placed him in the highest category of marksmanship qualification, often outperforming men who had been specifically marked for advanced infantry training and specialist roles. His shooting groups were tight and consistent, his trigger control was smooth and practiced, and his ability to adapt to different ranges and conditions suggested years of practical experience rather than merely innate talent. His platoon sergeant, a career soldier named William Rodriguez from the vast ranching country of West Texas, noticed immediately that James had an unusual gift that transcended basic competency. Rodriguez himself had been a competitive shooter before the conflict began, traveling to regional and national matches where he had competed against some of the finest marksmen in the country, and he recognized natural talent combined with disciplined practice when he saw it manifest in a recruit. One particularly memorable afternoon in March, after weeks of intensive training in various weather conditions and tactical scenarios, James had placed 30 consecutive rounds within a 2-inch grouping at 200 yards distance, a feat that represented extraordinary consistency and control. The target, examined carefully by multiple instructors who wanted to verify what they were seeing, showed a cluster of holes so tight that many of them overlapped, creating an almost single ragged opening in the center of the bullseye. This level of precision was rare even among experienced soldiers and was virtually unheard of in a recruit with only a few weeks of military training. James accomplished this not through luck, but through the application of fundamental techniques that had been drilled into him by his grandfather during countless hours in the Michigan forests, combined with the physical conditioning and mental discipline that military training had reinforced. He approached the rifle cleaning station after this remarkable performance, his demeanor calm and professional, despite the extraordinary nature of what he had just accomplished. Rodriguez approached him there, speaking quietly and choosing his words with careful deliberation. Fully aware that other soldiers were within earshot and that anything said might be overheard and misconstrued, in an environment where racial tensions simmered constantly beneath the surface of military discipline and order, he told James that there was a sniper training program being organized for the division and that he wanted to recommend James for the course. James felt a surge of excitement, but tried to keep his expression neutral. In the segregated military of 1943, opportunities for black soldiers to serve in specialized roles were extremely limited. The recommendation went up the chain of command to Captain Harold Matheson, a white officer from Virginia who commanded the training company. Matheson reviewed the paperwork with barely concealed skepticism. He called Rodriguez into his office and asked him directly if he thought a colored soldier could handle the mental demands of sniper work. Rodriguez, standing at attention, chose his words carefully. He said that Private Thornton had the best natural shooting ability he had seen in 15 years of military service, and that his scores spoke for themselves. Matheson authorized James to attend the first week of sniper training, making it clear that this was provisional, and that any deficiency would result in immediate removal from the program. The training was conducted at a remote section of the base where candidates learned fieldcraft, camouflage techniques, range estimation, and advanced marksmanship. The course was taught by Lieutenant Charles Webster, a West Point graduate who had studied European methods of sniper warfare and was determined to produce elite marksmen. James excelled in the practical exercises. He could estimate ranges to within 5% accuracy using only his eye. His stalking skills, refined through years of hunting, allowed him to move through brush without creating sound or visible disturbance. His shooting remained consistently excellent under various conditions, including wind, rain, and low light. But there was one instructor who viewed his presence with open hostility. Master Sergeant Frank Dutton had served in the First World War and held deeply entrenched beliefs about military hierarchy and racial capabilities. During classroom instruction, Dutton would ask James complicated questions about ballistics and atmospheric effects on trajectory, then interrupt his answers to suggest he was reciting memorized information without true understanding. During field exercises, Dutton would position himself near James and provide a running commentary of criticism that other students did not receive. In the fourth week of training, the candidates participated in a comprehensive field problem that would determine who would graduate to the final phase of the program. Each student had to successfully stalk to within 200 meters of an observation post, manned by instructors, set up a firing position, and take a simulated shot at a target without being detected. James drew a particularly difficult approach that required crossing an open meadow and navigating a rocky streambed. He began his stalk at dawn, moving in tiny increments whenever the wind rustled the grass to mask any sound. It took him 3 hours to cross terrain that could be walked in 15 minutes. He used every depression in the ground, every shadow, every moment when the observer's attention shifted. He reached his firing position, a slight rise behind a fallen log, and settled in with his rifle. Through his scope, he could see the target clearly marked in the observation post. He went through his mental checklist, breathing controlled, wind estimated at 4 miles per hour from left to right, range confirmed at 187 meters. He squeezed an imaginary trigger and whispered the word bang softly to himself. Lieutenant Webster, who had been observing through binoculars, never saw James during the entire stalk. When the time limit expired, Webster radioed for the students to reveal their positions. James stood up from behind the log, less than 175 meters from the observation post, and Webster actually jumped in surprise. He had been looking directly at that area multiple times and had seen nothing. Webster made a note in his evaluation book with a notation that this was one of the finest stalks he had ever witnessed. But when the final selections were announced, James's name was not on the list. 8 men were chosen to continue to advanced sniper training. James was told to report back to his regular infantry company. No explanation was provided officially. But Sergeant Rodriguez quietly told him that Master Sergeant Dutton had written an evaluation stating that while James had mechanical skills, he lacked the cognitive capacity and emotional stability required for independent operations behind enemy lines. The evaluation included phrases like lacks initiative in complex problem-solving and demonstrates limited understanding of tactical concepts beyond basic execution. James felt the bitter sting of injustice wash over him like cold water, but he had no recourse within the rigid military hierarchy, where a black enlisted man simply did not challenge the written evaluations of white officers and senior sergeants, regardless of how unfair or inaccurate those evaluations might be. The military justice system, such as it was for enlisted men, offered no real avenue for appeal against subjective assessments by superiors, and any attempt to protest would likely result in punishment rather than reconsideration. He understood with painful clarity that this was not truly about his capabilities or potential, but about assumptions and prejudices so deeply embedded in the culture that they operated automatically, without conscious thought or malice necessarily, simply as the default way of ordering the world. He returned to his regular infantry company in the 92nd Division, carrying his equipment and his disappointment with equal weight, and prepared for deployment overseas to whatever theater of operations the Army deemed appropriate for a segregated black unit. He said absolutely nothing to his fellow soldiers about what had happened during the sniper training course, about the skills he had demonstrated, or about the evaluation that had ended his participation. Some burdens were too personal and too bitter to share, even with comrades who might understand because they faced similar injustices in their own military experiences. He simply focused on his assigned tasks as an ordinary rifleman, cleaning his weapon meticulously, maintaining his equipment to the highest standards, and preparing mentally for the realities of combat that he knew awaited him somewhere across the Atlantic Ocean in the vast conflict that was consuming Europe and threatening to spread even further across the globe. The 92nd Infantry Division, known throughout the military as the Buffalo Soldiers Division, in honor of the historic black cavalry regiments that had served on the American frontier in the decades following the Civil War, shipped to Italy in July of 1944 aboard transport vessels crowded with thousands of soldiers, making the dangerous Atlantic crossing. The division entered active combat operations along the Gothic Line, a formidable defensive position that enemy forces had constructed across the mountainous spine of northern Italy, utilizing the natural terrain advantages of steep slopes, narrow valleys, and easily defended high ground. James served as a standard rifleman in heavy fighting that lasted through the brutal summer heat and into the cooler autumn months, where his unit faced well-prepared defensive positions manned by experienced soldiers who knew how to use the terrain to maximum advantage and who extracted a heavy price for every meter of ground gained. The division suffered significant losses as it fought its way through the Italian mountains, attacking fortified positions that dominated key routes and struggling against an enemy that had months to prepare elaborate defenses incorporating concrete bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, and extensive minefields. James participated in numerous engagements during this period, experiencing the chaos and terror of modern combat, witnessing friends and comrades fall to enemy fire, and learning the hard lessons that only actual battle can teach about survival, tactical awareness, and the grim realities of warfare. In November of 1944, as the Allied advance continued across multiple fronts and the strategic situation evolved, elements of the 92nd Division were transferred to France to participate in operations supporting the main offensive thrust toward the border with Germany itself. James's company was assigned to a particularly challenging sector in the Vosges Mountains, an ancient range that formed a natural barrier between the Alsace Plain and the interior of France. Characterized by rugged terrain covered in dense coniferous forests that provided excellent concealment for small units, but made coordinated large-scale operations extremely difficult to execute effectively. The forests stretched for miles in every direction, broken only occasionally by small mountain villages, isolated farmsteads, and narrow roads that wound through the valleys, connecting the scattered human settlements. The German forces in the area were conducting a fighting withdrawal, a tactical maneuver designed to delay the Allied advance while preserving combat power for future defensive operations closer to their national borders. However, they had left behind specially trained stay-behind units whose specific job was to disrupt Allied supply lines and communications infrastructure, operating independently with considerable freedom of action and detailed knowledge of the local terrain that gave them significant advantages in this type of irregular warfare. These stay-behind units included experienced soldiers, many of them veterans of years of combat on the Eastern Front, who had survived the brutal fighting against Soviet forces and had been transferred west to apply their hard-won tactical knowledge against the American and British armies. They operated in small groups ranging from 4 to 12 men, with considerable independence and flexibility to choose their targets and methods based on what they observed and what opportunities presented themselves. Their typical operations included ambushing supply convoys moving through mountain roads where the terrain restricted movement and prevented rapid response, cutting telephone and telegraph lines that connected Allied units and headquarters, destroying bridges and culverts to impede the forward movement of heavy equipment and supplies, and conducting reconnaissance on Allied positions to gather intelligence about strength, disposition, and intentions that could be radioed back to higher headquarters. They would strike suddenly from concealed positions, inflict casualties and damage, and then slip away into the vast forests before Allied forces could organize an effective response or bring superior firepower to bear on their location. The American military response was hampered by the sheer difficulty of locating small, highly mobile groups operating in terrain that offered unlimited hiding places and escape routes, fighting an enemy who could choose when and where to engage and who could simply vanish into the landscape when the tactical situation turned against them. On November 18th, James's company commander, Captain Robert Hayes, called together his platoon leaders to discuss a particular problem. A senior German officer had been observed in a farmhouse near the crossroads of two important supply routes. Intelligence suggested that this officer was coordinating the activities of multiple stay-behind groups and that his removal would significantly disrupt enemy operations in the sector. The farmhouse was under observation, and it appeared that several officers used it as a meeting point during nighttime hours when they felt secure from air attack. Captain Hayes wanted to organize a raid on the farmhouse, but his battalion commander had denied permission. The risk of casualties was considered too high relative to the potential gain, and higher command believed that the German units would eventually withdraw on their own as the Allied advance continued. Hayes was frustrated because his supply convoys continued to face attacks and his men continued to die in ambushes. He knew the location of enemy leaders but lacked authorization to act decisively. That evening, Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been transferred to the 92nd Division along with James, approached the captain with a suggestion. He said that he knew a soldier who could potentially accomplish what a full raid could not. Rodriguez explained that Private Thornton was an exceptional marksman who had been unjustly excluded from sniper training, and that he could be sent forward on a reconnaissance patrol with authorization to engage targets of opportunity if the situation warranted. Hayes was skeptical but willing to consider unconventional approaches. He called James to his command post and asked him directly about his shooting ability and whether he felt confident taking shots at extended range in darkness with limited visibility. James replied honestly. He said that he had hunted at night many times, that his grandfather had taught him to shoot by sound and instinct when visual identification was impossible, and that he understood the capabilities and limitations of his rifle. He did not mention the sniper training or the evaluation that had ended his participation. Hayes made a decision that bent the regulations without quite breaking them. He would authorize a reconnaissance patrol to the area near the farmhouse with James as part of the team. If James happened to observe legitimate military targets, and if the tactical situation provided an opportunity for engagement, Without compromising the patrol's safety, he was authorized to use his initiative as circumstances dictated. Hayes did not explicitly order James to act as a sniper, but the implication was clear. James spent the entire afternoon of November 19th preparing his equipment with the meticulous care that separated professional soldiers from amateurs, attending to every detail that might make the difference between success and failure in the operation ahead. He cleaned his Springfield rifle until every metal surface gleamed even in dim light, carefully running patches through the barrel until they came out completely white and free of any residue, even though the weapon was already in excellent condition from his habitual maintenance routines. The Springfield was a bolt-action design that had served American forces since the First World War, reliable and accurate when properly maintained, capable of impressive precision in the hands of a skilled marksman. He checked his ammunition with extraordinary thoroughness, selecting 20 rounds from his available supply and examining each individual cartridge for any defect in the brass casing that might cause a malfunction, any deformation in the bullet that might affect its flight characteristics, or any sign of corrosion or damage that could compromise reliability. Each round he selected was perfect, or as close to perfect as mass-produced ammunition could be, and he arranged them carefully in the canvas bandolier he would carry. He adjusted his rifle sling to the exact tension he preferred based on years of shooting experience, finding the balance between stability and comfort that would allow him to maintain a steady aim for extended periods without fatigue affecting his performance. He verified that his iron sights were properly aligned by taking careful aim at distant reference points, mentally calculating the slight adjustments that would be necessary for different ranges and conditions. He did not have a telescopic scope because those precious instruments were reserved exclusively for officially designated snipers who had graduated from formal training programs, and James had been denied that designation despite possessing the necessary skills. As darkness fell, James joined a four-man patrol led by Corporal Thomas Jefferson, a combat veteran from Philadelphia who had fought through the Italian campaign. The other two members were Private Eddie Martinez from New Mexico and Private Robert King from Ohio. Jefferson briefed them on the route they would take through the forest to reach an observation point overlooking the crossroads. He emphasized that their primary mission was reconnaissance and that they were to avoid contact unless absolutely necessary. The patrol moved out at 2100 hours, walking silently through the pine forest under a moonless sky. The temperature had dropped to just above freezing, and their breath formed small clouds in the darkness. They moved slowly, stopping frequently to listen for any sound that might indicate enemy presence. The forest was not entirely silent. Wind moved through the trees, small animals rustled in the undergrowth, and in the distance they could hear the occasional rumble of artillery from another sector of the front. It took them 2 hours to cover the 3 kilometers to their observation point, a small rocky outcrop that provided a clear view of the crossroads and the farmhouse beyond. The farmhouse was a typical Vosges structure, 2 stories with a steeply pitched roof and thick stone walls. A barn stood adjacent to it, and several smaller outbuildings were scattered around the property. Dim light showed through blackout curtains in several windows, indicating that the building was occupied. James settled into a position among the rocks where he had a stable rest for his rifle. He could see the farmhouse entrance clearly at an estimated range of 290 meters. A long shot, but well within his capability. Jefferson positioned himself nearby with binoculars, while Martinez and King took up security positions, covering their flanks and rear. They waited. For the first hour, nothing happened. The farmhouse remained quiet, except for the occasional shadow passing in front of the curtained windows. A few enlisted soldiers came and went, their movements suggesting they were performing routine tasks like bringing firewood or checking on vehicles parked behind the barn. James controlled his breathing and remained motionless, a skill he had learned in the Michigan forests where deer would detect the slightest movement. At 23:45 hours, a vehicle approached from the east, its headlights masked to mere slits as per blackout protocols. The vehicle, a Kubelwagen similar to an American Jeep, pulled up to the farmhouse entrance. 2 officers emerged, their rank visible even in the dim light by their long coats and the way the enlisted men around them came to attention. They entered the farmhouse quickly and the door closed behind them. Jefferson whispered to James that those were definitely senior officers based on the reception they received. James nodded but said nothing. He watched and waited. His grandfather had taught him that patience was the most important quality in hunting. Rushing led to mistakes. The prey would reveal itself when the time was right. 20 minutes later, another vehicle arrived, this one from the west. 3 more officers emerged and entered the farmhouse. Jefferson made notes on a small pad, documenting the time and number of personnel observed. He was fulfilling the reconnaissance mission by gathering intelligence on enemy movements and the apparent importance of this location as a command post. Inside the farmhouse, though James and his patrol could not see or hear it, a meeting was taking place that would prove fatal for those attending. A senior major from the Corps staff was briefing local unit commanders on the planned withdrawal schedule for their sector. The German forces were under orders to delay the Allied advance, but to avoid being trapped by the rapidly moving enemy columns. The major was explaining which routes should be used and when each unit should begin its movement. He had brought written orders that would be distributed to the commanders before they departed. At 00:30 hours, the meeting concluded. The door to the farmhouse opened and officers began to emerge. They stood in a small group near the entrance, several of them lighting cigarettes despite the blackout regulations, feeling secure in the belief that American forces were still several kilometers away and that no patrol would venture this deep into contested territory at night. Jefferson turned to James and whispered that this was the opportunity they had come for. He asked James if he could make the shot. James studied the group through his iron sights. The range was just under 300 meters. There was a slight breeze from his left, perhaps 3 miles per hour. The temperature was cold, which would make his rifle shoot slightly higher than at warmer temperatures. The targets were illuminated only by the dim light from the doorway and the glow of their cigarettes, but his eyes had been adjusted to darkness for over 3 hours. James made a decision based on years of hunting experience and months of combat observation. He would not take a hasty shot at a single target. Instead, he would use the chaos created by the first shot to create opportunities for multiple engagements. The group of officers represented a concentration of enemy leadership that might not occur again. If he could disrupt their command structure significantly, it would potentially save American lives by reducing the effectiveness of enemy operations. He lined up his first shot on the officer, who appeared most senior, a man whose coat and bearing suggested high rank. James controlled his breathing, slowing his heart rate. He exhaled halfway and held it. He squeezed the trigger with steady pressure, not jerking but gradually increasing force until the rifle fired. The sound of the shot was sharp in the cold night air, and through his sights, James saw the officer collapse immediately. For a moment there was stunned silence at the farmhouse. The other officers stood frozen, not yet comprehending what had happened. Then someone shouted and the group began to scatter, but they made a fatal mistake driven by panic and lack of training for this situation. Instead of immediately taking cover, several officers ran toward the vehicles, presenting themselves as moving targets against the lighted doorway. James worked the bolt action of his Springfield, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a new round. The motion was automatic after thousands of repetitions in training and combat. He acquired his second target, an officer running toward the Kubelwagen. He led the target slightly to account for movement and fired. The officer went down. James worked the bolt again. His third target had dropped into a crouch but remained visible in profile against the light. James fired. The officer collapsed. Now the farmhouse area erupted in chaos. Someone inside extinguished the lights, plunging the area into darkness. Soldiers were shouting, and he could hear orders being given in German, though he did not understand the words. Several enlisted men ran out with weapons, firing in random directions because they had no idea where the shots were coming from. Their muzzle flashes revealed their positions, but James ignored them. His mission was to target leadership, not to engage in a general firefight that would accomplish nothing and endanger his patrol. He waited, rifle ready, watching for any officer who might expose himself. His patience was rewarded when a side door of the farmhouse opened and 2 figures emerged, moving quickly toward the barn. James could tell by their movement that these were officers trying to escape rather than enlisted men responding to the attack. He fired at the lead figure and saw him fall. The second figure dove behind a water trough. James watched the trough, waiting. Corporal Jefferson whispered urgently that they should consider withdrawing before the enemy organized a response and sent out search parties. James acknowledged, but asked for 2 more minutes. He kept his rifle trained on the area near the barn. The officer behind the trough would eventually have to move, and James knew from hunting that wounded or cornered prey would make a break when they thought the danger had passed. 3 minutes elapsed. 4. Then the officer behind the trough suddenly sprinted toward the tree line on the far side of the farmhouse property. It was a desperate run, the kind of panicked flight that occurs when someone can no longer stand the tension of waiting. James tracked him smoothly, led him by about 2 feet to account for his running speed at that range, and fired. The officer stumbled and fell. The situation at the farmhouse had now reached a point where the defenders were thoroughly disorganized. No one was taking charge, and the enlisted soldiers were firing at shadows. 2 more officers attempted to reach vehicles, and James engaged both, though the darkness and their erratic movement made precise shooting difficult. He believed he hit at least one of them. A machine gun opened fire from the farmhouse, raking the hillside in a wide arc. The gunner had no target, but was attempting to suppress whoever was attacking them. The tracers passed well above and to the left of James's position, but Jefferson made the decision that they needed to withdraw immediately. The enemy would soon organize a proper response, and a 4-man patrol would be overrun if they remained in place. James fired 3 more carefully aimed shots at figures moving near the vehicles, then followed his patrol as they pulled back into the forest. They moved quickly now, abandoning stealth for speed, putting distance between themselves and the farmhouse. Behind them, they could hear whistles blowing and vehicles starting as the German forces began to organize a search. The patrol made it back to American lines at 03:15 hours, exhausted but unharmed. Jefferson reported immediately to Captain Hayes, describing what they had observed and what had transpired. He stated that Private Thornton had engaged multiple enemy officers at long range in darkness, and that the confusion created at the farmhouse suggested the engagement had been highly successful. Hayes was initially concerned about the unauthorized nature of the action, but Jefferson pointed out that they had been authorized to engage targets of opportunity, and that a concentration of enemy officers qualified as exactly such a target. Hayes chose to document the patrol as a successful reconnaissance mission that had resulted in engagement with enemy forces, without emphasizing the sniper nature of the engagement. He submitted a report up the chain of command, noting that valuable intelligence had been gathered and that enemy leadership in the sector had been disrupted. What no one in the American command knew immediately was the true extent of what had occurred. Inside the German command structure, the events of November 19th created a crisis. The major from Corps Staff was among those who had been shot. 2 other field-grade officers were confirmed lost. Several junior officers were missing or wounded. The written orders for the withdrawal schedule had been abandoned at the farmhouse when the survivors fled, and they were recovered by an American patrol the following day. Over the next 48 hours, as German forces attempted to execute their planned withdrawal, the lack of coordination became apparent. Units missed their scheduled departure times because commanders had not received their orders. Some units withdrew too early, leaving gaps in the defensive line. Others waited too long and faced encirclement. The entire withdrawal schedule that should have been an orderly fighting retreat became a disorganized scramble. American intelligence officers analyzing the captured documents and the confused enemy movements realized that something significant had occurred at the farmhouse. They requested a detailed debriefing of the reconnaissance patrol. Jefferson and James were called to battalion headquarters, where they met with a major from the intelligence staff. The major questioned them extensively about what they had observed and the nature of the engagement. When James described his shooting in detail, including the ranges, lighting conditions, and number of shots fired, the major's expression changed from professional interest to genuine amazement. He asked James about his training, and James explained about the sniper course and why he had not completed it. The major requested James's service record and specifically asked to see his training evaluations. When he read Master Sergeant Dutton's assessment about James lacking cognitive capacity for sniper work, he actually laughed, though there was no humor in the sound. He said that what James had accomplished required not only exceptional shooting skill, but tactical intelligence, emotional control under extreme pressure, and the kind of patience that could not be taught. The Major wrote his own evaluation of the action, describing it as one of the most effective single engagements by an individual soldier that he had documented in his career. He recommended James for formal recognition and suggested that he be immediately assigned to sniper duties with proper equipment, including a telescopic sight. But institutional change moved slowly, and the recommendation worked its way through channels, while James returned to his regular duties with his company. He participated in several more patrols over the following weeks, and on 2 occasions he engaged enemy targets at long range when opportunities presented themselves. His fellow soldiers began to regard him with a mixture of respect and superstition, aware that when James carried his rifle into the forest, enemy soldiers often did not return from their positions. In January of 1945, James was finally issued a Springfield rifle equipped with a Unertl 8-power telescopic sight and officially designated as a scout sniper. The designation came through from division headquarters with a note that his previous training evaluation had been reviewed and found to be inconsistent with his demonstrated performance. The language was bureaucratic, a face-saving way of acknowledging that a serious error had been made without directly impugning Master Sergeant Dutton. James served as a sniper through the final months of the conflict in Europe, operating in the Vosges Mountains and later in operations along the German border. His confirmed total was never officially recorded because the nature of sniper work made confirmation difficult, but soldiers who served with him estimated that he successfully engaged at least 40 enemy targets during his time in combat. He was wounded once by shrapnel from an artillery round in March of 1945, but recovered and returned to duty before the end of hostilities. When the conflict in Europe ended in May, James was part of the occupation forces in southern Germany. He spent several months performing garrison duties before returning to the United States in August of 1945. He was discharged from the army in November, with the rank of sergeant and several commendations for valor, though not the major decorations that white soldiers with similar records often received. James returned to Detroit and resumed working in the automotive industry, eventually becoming a foreman at a Chrysler plant. He married in 1947 and raised 4 children. He rarely spoke about his military service, even with his family, carrying his experiences privately as many combat veterans did. When his children asked about the conflict, he would tell them only that he had served in Europe and that he was glad to have come home. In 1968, a researcher studying the history of the 92nd Infantry Division contacted James as part of an oral history project. The researcher had found references to a significant action in November of 1944 involving a reconnaissance patrol, and through military records had identified James as a participant. In a recorded interview that lasted 3 hours, James finally described in detail what had occurred that night at the farmhouse. He talked about the cold, the darkness, the concentration required to make accurate shots at long range with iron sights. He described the feeling of vindication mixed with sorrow, knowing that he had proved wrong those who had doubted him, but had done so through actions that took human lives. He explained that he had never felt joy or pride in what he had done, only a grim satisfaction that he had performed his duty effectively and protected his fellow soldiers. The researcher asked him about Master Sergeant Dutton's evaluation and whether he felt anger toward those who had denied him the sniper training. James's answer was measured and thoughtful. He said that anger was a luxury he could not afford during the conflict, when survival and mission accomplishment were the only things that mattered. He said that he had long since made peace with the injustices he faced, recognizing that they were symptoms of a larger societal illness that would take generations to cure. The researcher asked what he wanted people to understand about his experience. James said that he wanted them to know that ability and character were not determined by race, that the soldiers of the 92nd Division had fought with courage and skill despite facing discrimination from their own country, and that many black soldiers had performed acts of exceptional valor, that went unrecognized because the system was not designed to acknowledge their contributions. The interview was archived, but not widely distributed during James's lifetime. He died in 1992 at the age of 72, having lived a quiet life of dignity and hard work. His obituary in the Detroit newspaper mentioned his military service but included no details about his specific actions during the conflict. It was not until 2008 that a military historian researching sniper operations during the Second World War discovered the archived interview and began investigating the events of November 19, 1944. The historian obtained German records that had been captured at the end of the conflict and found documentation of the incident at the farmhouse. The German after-action reports described an attack by what they assumed was a sniper team, noting the confusion and casualties among officers and the disruption to planned operations. By cross-referencing the American and German documents, the historian was able to confirm that James's account was accurate and that the action had indeed been as significant as he described. The historian published an article in a military history journal detailing the incident and arguing that James deserved recognition as one of the most effective American snipers of the conflict, despite never having been officially trained or properly equipped until after he had already proved his ability. The article sparked renewed interest in the contributions of black soldiers during the Second World War, a topic that had received insufficient attention in mainstream military history. Several books and documentaries subsequently featured James's story as an example of both individual heroism and institutional failure, highlighting how prejudice and discrimination had denied the military the full benefit of talented soldiers and had denied those soldiers the recognition they deserved. In 2012, 20 years after his passing, James Thornton was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest military decoration, for his actions on November 19, 1944. The award was presented to his daughter at a ceremony at the Pentagon. In the citation, his actions were described as demonstrating exceptional courage, tactical acumen, and shooting skill under extremely difficult conditions, and it was noted that his success in disrupting enemy command and control had contributed significantly to the success of Allied operations in that sector. The ceremony was attended by several military historians, veterans advocates, and active duty service members who had studied James's actions as part of their own training. A colonel from the Army's sniper school gave a presentation analyzing the technical aspects of what James had accomplished, noting that making accurate shots at 300 meters in darkness with iron sights would challenge even today's highly trained snipers with modern equipment. One of James's grandsons, who had joined the Marine Corps and served in Iraq, spoke at the ceremony about what his grandfather's example meant to him. He said that knowing his grandfather had faced not only the enemy, but also the prejudice of his own military, and had overcome both through quiet competence and unshakable dignity, had given him strength during his own difficult moments of service. He said that his grandfather never sought recognition, but deserved it nonetheless, and that this long-delayed acknowledgement honored not just one man, but all the soldiers who had served with excellence while facing discrimination. The story of James Thornton raises uncomfortable questions about how many other soldiers of exceptional ability were denied opportunities because of the prejudices of their time. How many potential snipers, pilots, commanders, and specialists were relegated to menial duties because evaluators could not see past the color of their skin? How many acts of valor went unrecognized because the system assumed that black soldiers were incapable of extraordinary achievement? The technical evaluation that excluded James from sniper training was not an isolated incident, but rather one example of a systematic pattern of discrimination that affected every aspect of military service for black soldiers. They served in segregated units, were often assigned to support roles rather than combat positions, and received less training and inferior equipment compared to white units. When they did fight, their successes were minimized while their failures were magnified and used to justify continued discrimination. Yet despite these obstacles, black soldiers served with distinction in every theater of the conflict. The Tuskegee Airmen proved that black pilots could perform as well as any in the world. The tank crews of the 761st Tank Battalion fought through some of the heaviest combat in Europe. The soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division, including James Thornton, demonstrated that courage and skill had nothing to do with race and everything to do with training, leadership, and opportunity. The farmhouse incident also illustrates something about the nature of military effectiveness that transcends race. James succeeded not because he had superhuman abilities, but because he had fundamental skills honed through practice, the temperament to remain calm under pressure, and the intelligence to adapt his techniques to the specific situation he faced. These are the same qualities that define effective soldiers in any era, yet the military establishment of 1944 assumed that black soldiers could not possess them. The irony is that Master Sergeant Dutton's evaluation, intended to exclude James from sniper training, became a permanent part of the historical record that now highlights the injustice of that exclusion. The document stands as evidence of institutional racism, its assertions thoroughly disproven by James's subsequent actions. When historians write about this incident, they invariably quote that evaluation because the contrast between its claims and the reality of James's performance is so stark. For James himself, the recognition that came decades after his death would likely have been less important than the simple respect and fair treatment he should have received during his service. He never sought fame or glory. He simply wanted the opportunity to use his abilities in service of his country and to be judged on his merit rather than his race. That this basic expectation was denied to him and millions of other black Americans represents one of the profound moral failures of that generation. Yet the story also demonstrates something hopeful about human resilience and capability. Despite facing discrimination that would have justified bitterness and resentment, James performed his duties with excellence. He did not allow others' low expectations to define his own self-image or limit his efforts. When given the slightest opportunity, even one that came through irregular channels and required him to prove himself under the most difficult circumstances, he succeeded spectacularly. The night of November 19, 1944, was bitterly cold in the Vosges Mountains, and a young soldier from Michigan did something extraordinary with a rifle and iron sights that many trained snipers could not replicate. He did it not for glory or recognition, but because it was his job and because other soldiers depended on him. He proved that intelligence, skill, and courage could not be measured by the color of a person's skin, even though he should never have been required to prove something so fundamentally obvious. In the decades since that night, the military has made significant progress in addressing discrimination and providing equal opportunities to all service members. The sniper school that once excluded James Thornton now trains soldiers of every race and background, evaluating them solely on their demonstrated abilities. The lessons learned from historical injustices have led to institutional changes, though the work of creating truly equal opportunity remains ongoing. James Thornton's story serves as both an inspiration and a cautionary tale. It inspires because it shows what human beings can accomplish when they refuse to be limited by others' prejudices. It cautions because it reminds us how much talent and potential can be wasted when institutions make decisions based on bias rather than merit. Every soldier who was denied opportunity because of race represented not just an injustice to that individual, but a loss to the military's overall effectiveness and capability. The 12 officers who gathered at that farmhouse on November 19, 1944 had no idea that they were being observed by someone they would have dismissed as unworthy of consideration. Their prejudices and those of the military establishment that evaluated James Thornton were not just morally wrong, but tactically foolish. They had created an enemy who was underestimated, and underestimation in military operations is often fatal. There is a profound lesson in the fact that the soldier they called too lacking in intelligence to be a sniper succeeded through the application of intelligence at every stage of that night's operation. He assessed the tactical situation correctly. He calculated ranges and wind effects accurately. He recognized the opportunity presented by the concentration of enemy leadership. He exercised fire discipline and patience. He adapted his technique to the specific circumstances. These are all cognitive functions of the highest order, precisely the qualities that Master Sergeant Dutton claimed he lacked. The German officers at the farmhouse that night were defeated not by superior numbers or firepower, but by one man's skill, determination, and intelligence. They were victims of their enemy's prejudice that created an opportunity for someone extraordinary to slip through and prove himself in the most definitive way possible. The chaos and confusion that followed those shots in the darkness rippled through the entire German command structure in that sector, degrading their effectiveness at a critical moment. For the American soldiers who benefited from the disruption of enemy operations, James's actions may have meant the difference between life and death, though most of them never knew who was responsible or what had occurred. Supply convoys moved with less harassment, patrols encountered less organized resistance. The withdrawal of enemy forces became a scramble rather than a controlled retreat. These outcomes saved American lives, even if the connection to one man's shooting on one cold night was invisible to those who benefited. And that, perhaps, is the most fitting legacy for James Thornton. He did not serve for recognition or fame. He served because it was his duty, because his country needed him despite not valuing him properly, and because other soldiers depended on him. The fact that his contributions went largely unrecognized during his lifetime does not diminish them. The fact that recognition finally came, even posthumously, represents progress of a sort, though it cannot undo the injustice of what he faced. The night sky over the Vosges Mountains on November 19, 1944, witnessed an act of extraordinary marksmanship by a soldier who should have been officially trained and equipped for exactly that role, but instead had to prove himself through irregular means under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. The cold, the darkness, the distance, and the pressure would have challenged any shooter. That James succeeded so completely, while using iron sights and functioning with only the field craft he had taught himself, speaks to capability that transcended the limitations others tried to impose on him. In the end, the story is not really about shooting or military tactics, though those elements are important. It is about human potential and the damage done when that potential is suppressed or denied because of prejudice. It is about dignity maintained in the face of injustice. It is about excellence pursued for its own sake rather than for recognition. It is about a man who knew his own worth even when the institutions around him refused to acknowledge it, and who proved that worth in the most definitive and consequential way possible. The officers who evaluated James Thornton and found him lacking never had to face the consequences of their error directly. Master Sergeant Dutton likely never knew that the soldier he dismissed went on to accomplish something remarkable. Captain Matheson, who authorized only provisional attendance at sniper training, probably never heard the full story of what James did after being excluded from that program. They lived their lives and ended their careers without accounting for their prejudice or recognizing how wrong they had been. But history has rendered its own judgment, preserving the record of their error and contrasting it with the reality of James's achievement. The evaluation that was meant to exclude him instead became evidence of institutional injustice. The assumptions about his capabilities were not just proven wrong, but spectacularly, undeniably wrong, in a way that could not be explained away or minimized. For anyone who faces doubt or discrimination, who is told they lack the ability or intelligence or temperament to succeed, James Thornton's story offers a powerful counter-narrative. He was told he was inadequate by people who had the power to enforce that judgment, denying him opportunity and recognition. He could have accepted that judgment and performed only to the minimal expectations placed upon him. Instead, he maintained his own standards and his own sense of what he was capable of achieving. When opportunity finally came, even through irregular channels, he was ready and he succeeded. The cold metal of a Springfield rifle, the discipline of controlled breathing, the mathematics of trajectory and wind, the psychology of patience, the courage to act when the moment arrived, these were the tools and qualities that James brought to bear on a November night in 1944. They were the same tools and qualities possessed by any effective sniper, regardless of race. The only difference was that he had to prove himself without the benefit of proper training or equipment, making his success even more remarkable. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.